I'm James Burton. I'm from England, but I work in Germany at the moment, where I do postdoctoral research. But I did my PhD in London at Goldsmiths, University of London, and it was on Henri Bergson and P.K. Dick. Today I'm going to talk about, well, the title on the schedule is Self-Induced Amnesia, and I did make a conscious effort to forget it, and I replaced it with another title which didn't make it onto the schedule, which is Perhaps He's Collaborating in the Writing of This Right Now, and that's a quotation from the Exegesis when Dick is talking about Valis. Okay, so thanks everyone for resisting the urge to take the break early. I know it's been a long afternoon. My talk is, I didn't know, but I guess my answer to Eric Davis' question earlier, what the fuck do we do with the exegesis? And I don't need to recount what the exegesis is, I guess, for this crowd. But I would like to say, just to highlight one thing about the term exegesis, which is that I'm sure when Dick starts using it, he is using it in a sort of tradition of biblical exegesis, of theological interpretation. But we do know that he's already on some strange ground where he's interpreting his own visions. And I just want to highlight that I quite like to think of the etymological background of exegesis, which is a leading out, which becomes unfolding interpretation and so on. But I think of it as also a kind of a dynamic version of the traditional biblical interpretation. This is more of a leading out of the maze or the black iron prison. And secondly, I see the word soteriology, which does crop up in the exegesis, in a similar way. Again, soteriology would be, in traditional theology, the logos of salvation, the study of how to find salvation. But I think in the exegesis, it becomes something active and dynamic, producing salvation, making it yourself. So I find particular significance in this late exegesis entry, in which he declares that the whole project has been soteriological. He says, everything that has happened and that I have been shown, told, every revelation, it's all one vast soteriological engine / program. Now, of course, any statement in the exegesis finds its negation somewhere, usually the next page or the same entry. But this one really sort of stands out for me because until I got to page 888 of the recent edition, this had been my approach to the whole of Dick's work. And then turns out, of course, like the Bible, you'll find anything you want in the exegesis eventually, but it's still worth quoting. Okay. However, the success or the failure of the exegesis, as we heard earlier in the discussions with Eric Davis, is constantly in question. And, you know, Dick himself is constantly asking, what the hell is going on with this? What am I doing? I thought I'd quote two snippets, two passages where you get a sense of the two poles that he's oscillating between. This one's from 1975 to 76. It's uncertain. It has been some time since I developed any conflicting theories about my experience. Now it's an elaboration and a filling in, lapidary-wise, of detail. Sorry about the English accent, it just doesn't sound right with Philip Dick. But it's mine. I have created a consistent explanation based on the experience and on research. I doubt if it will ever undergo any substantial modifications. This makes up for everything and anything in my life and creates creates meaning of an ultimate order in my life. Okay. And then another entry from a little while later. This is all I know. As KW says, the trail doesn't just peter out, it ends at a brick wall. The exegesis is a failure in terms of answering questions. For each answer derived, an even greater mystery is exposed. And he goes on, I can't find him. I neither understand nor remember. And so I quote these. Anyone who's spent much time with the exegesis will recognize these as the sorts of things that crop up all the time. revelations, epiphanies, I've got it, I've found the key to Valis, I've found the key to everything, and then, oh no I haven't, oh, this whole thing's been a waste of time. And he goes between these two. And what I want to say here is that understanding this as a soteriological project of a particular kind allows us to understand, I think, what is making him have this oscillation between epiphany and despair, or faith and doubt. Overall, the exegesis probably contains more of the joy of revelation and the exhilaration of solving mysteries and riddles than it does of self-doubt or doubt in Valis. But when those doubts are expressed, the sense of loneliness and despair is quite intense, presumably because Dick is staking everything, all his hopes that both the universe and his life might prove meaningful, on the reality of Valis and the revelatory value of the 2-3-74 experiences. It's like an all or nothing situation. Except what I think Dick's great achievement in the exegesis is, if there is an achievement, is to transform this into an all and nothing situation. He won't give up on either side of what for most people would be two contradictory facets. So throughout his life, this particular dual nature of many dual natures is visible in Dick, according to biographies and interviews and so on. And we can characterize it in terms of a readiness to believe anything alongside a sort of radical skepticism, a readiness to doubt anything. And that's, by the by, probably why so many of his novels are concerned not only with the construction but the deconstruction of myriad possible worlds. But credulity and skepticism, although they're opposed when they're found in moderation and seem to go in different directions, can actually be said to converge when they're taken to extremes. So I think this is well illustrated in Dick's relationship to causality, which is often quoted as one of his sort of earliest forms of skepticism. Like the philosopher David Hume, Dick found it impossible or very difficult to accept the causal relationships between events that most people, as he noticed, seem to take for granted. And the critique of the common understanding of causality was at the heart of Hume's skepticism, which Dick appreciated from a young age. And it's a similar stance, at least in philosophical terms, which accounts for Dick's consistent questioning of the nature of reality as it appears. Yet the apparent refusal to accept anything at face value also constitutes a radical openness to all possibilities. Okay, in a way, it's more radical to say maybe there is a God. It's more skeptical even to say maybe there's a God than it is to say, it's ridiculous, there is no God. Maybe. And it's less widely known that Hume continued to believe in a God, even through all his skepticism, that would have to be beyond his understanding. And he even regarded that belief as an inevitable facet of human nature. So he had the naturalistic understanding of God. He said, I cannot deny that I want there to be a God, and in some sense I believe there is. Although he did question the anthropomorphization of God as something insufficient. So I mention Hume not just in passing, but in order to highlight the likelihood that Dick's oscillation between faith and doubt, or credulity and skepticism, constitutes something more than his individual pathology. It's clear that he needs God, or Valis, or a saviour of some kind, or Zebra, or whatever name he gives it on that page. And it's also clear that he's creative enough to imagine one, and even his imagination is even powerful enough to convince him that this entity has come from somewhere outside his own mind. But through all this, for me at least, his sanity remains intact, as does his critical acumen, so that he cannot simply accept a revelatory vision or experience without wanting to question it, to take it apart and figure out how it works. And in doing so, he's constantly in danger of discovering that, like the toad at the end of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, or like Railgum's world in Time Out of Joint, discovering that it's actually an artificial construct, and in fact, one that he's made to keep himself from going over the edge. Now, in attempting to cope with these problematics, that the saviour must be invented, but must also appear to come from outside, and that it must invite contemplation, but contemplating it, reflecting on it, threatens to reveal its fictional status, Dick, I would suggest, is undertaking a soteriological activity with general as opposed to merely personal significance. As Hume suggests, the invention of gods, the discovery of divine order, is a basic activity of the human mind. The task of what I see as Dick's imminent soteriology is to figure out how this can be accepted by the rational part of the human mind, the other part that's also supposedly intrinsic. Okay. And the exegesis, as we know, is heavily influenced by Dick's interpretations of Gnosticism, and Dick spends a great deal of time and effort attempting to discern the mystic gnosis, the secret knowledge that he thinks has been imparted to him through the 2-3-74 experiences and his ongoing communications with Vallis. The numerous epiphanic moments at which he exclaims that he's finally worked it all out, found the key to everything and so on, pepper the exegesis, but of course they seldom seem to last very long. And we don't know if they sustain him for days or months or minutes, but they're always followed eventually or sooner or later by another entry that casts doubt on them. And then the epiphany is negated or forgotten. This is the self-induced amnesia, allowing new theories to appear and new chains of theological wrangling and speculation to set off in different directions. Now, okay, if we accept that Dick himself is the creator of Vallis, then in a sense the true gnosis, the secret key to understanding its nature, is that it is a fiction. It is his creation. Many of the epiphanic discoveries of different possible gnoses that you find in the different theoretical speculations in the exegesis, I think, function to keep this mundane gnosis somewhat obscured. So the possibility that Dick himself is the source of Vallis is repeatedly raised during the exegesis, but for the first few years at least, it's knowledge that must always be kept at some distance, at arm's length, so it's encoded into different forms. And one recurrent form that's quite well known to us, I mean, not to everybody in the world, but is the Gnostically inflected notion of the god or the gods who've lost their memories. Usually at the same time trapping themselves in a prison world from which they no longer remember how to escape. And here's one statement, just as a quick summary of this idea in the exegesis. Quote, "We created a fake world, went into it voluntarily, and voluntarily shed our memories, and can't get back out, but would like to. However, foreseeing this, we providentially laid down clues in advance to remind us when the going would get too tough." And those who are more familiar with Vallis than the exegesis will also recognize the theme. The novel Vallis, rather. I'm always tripping myself up when writing it. So when Dick deploys this idea, he, as Eric suggested, on face value, or at least I think when it comes up earlier in the exegesis, the maze is this world, the world that most people take for granted, the world of appearances. And he's portraying in this sort of metaphor, or this fable, the 2-3-74 experiences as the trigger for a process of amnesis, the recall of lost memory, which will enable him, and possibly everyone else, to find the way out. Remember, the exegesis is the leading out, as I was saying earlier. But at other moments, especially later on, he suggests that that we who induced our amnesia and went into the maze did it as a game or a test to see if we could get out of it, see if we could figure the way out. And of course, he also talks about the maze shifting as you try to negotiate it. So you think you found one, you're starting to find a way out, and then you turn around and it's different. And all of this sort of, to me, indicates that there's a much less mystical interpretation, which I've been getting at already, that he has created a maze for himself in the experiences with Vallis and in writing the exegesis. He's created a riddle for himself to solve, and realizing the truth would end the game. It would leave him right back where he started before he started looking for a savior. but with his hopes of salvation pretty much destroyed. I can't imagine someone giving up on the exegesis and then having another go. Probably he would have found a way to do it. But so every time he approaches this gnosis, the mundane gnosis, or seems to be on the point of grasping it, he has to retreat, and he shifts the maze, and he introduces some new element that transforms what had appeared to be an exit into just another doorway leading into a whole new part of the maze. A similar function can be identified in Dick's frequent recognition. I think I've got exegesis that this kind of scenario had appeared in his pre-2374 fiction. The plot of one of his earliest texts, Cosmic Puppets, centers on an amnesiac god recovering his memory, time out of joint, describes the scenario of an amnesiac savior. Remember, he is a savior, as Doug Mackey was saying, with the Little Green Man competition. Trapped in his own artificial world. It was him who retreated first before the military built a version of his sort of nostalgic childhood world, following the clues to find an anamnesis and escape. And Dick observes in the exegesis that he depicted similar scenarios in Ubik, Maze of Death, Palmer Eldritch, and other novels. I would point to A Scanner Darkly and We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, the short story, as ones in which particularly the protagonist is involved in inducing their own amnesia. And Maze of Death, of course, as well. Yeah, Maze of Death is one that Dick does talk about a lot in the exegesis. Yet he always manages to sidestep, or for most of the exegesis, manages to sidestep the mundane conclusion of these forerunners, that this is a theme that has interested him for a long while, and that he's incorporated into his invention of Valis. Okay, so just to summarize a little bit, one of the throughout the exegesis you can say that he's doing this in lots of different ways. That he's created Valis to fulfill certain needs, but then transformed this creation into something strange and transcendent or deeply extraordinary rather than just recognizing it. Okay. And I think I won't go into it, but I think the split mind thing, the Thomas, the thoughts of the ancient Christian inside his head, is another way of doing this. He's always othering himself in order to allow this savior that is at root part of him to be something outside of him. If this was a straightforward matter of an individual's personal pathology, it might be tempting to view Dick's cycle of revelation and amnesia, discovering and forgetting his relationship to Valis, the true relationship, he's the creator, in terms of the protagonist at the end of the film Memento. I guess most people have probably seen it. If not, this is a spoiler. But you watch it backwards anyway, so it shouldn't matter, I guess. So having apparently achieved his life's purpose of discovering and exercising revenge upon his wife's killer, the protagonist realizes that his existence is from that day going to be meaningless, and so he immediately fabricates for himself a new quest. He changes some clues and creates some others, and then that will set him off on a quest for a new killer. He does enough to mean that there will be someone at the end of it, and lets his anti-retrograde amnesia eradicate the truth that he just ecstatically embraced a few moments earlier. But I think it would be a disservice to Dick, a failure to appreciate the persistence of his intellect and his self-awareness, and indeed his great capacity, I think, for remaining sane beneath all the craziness and that he courted, that he engaged with. It would be a disservice to all of that to suppose that he could remain blind to his own role in the creation of Valis. And yet, it would seem that in that case, he ought to eventually be trapped by the binary logic of these two possibilities that both seem to end in failure. If he were to completely accept that Valis was nothing other than the product of his own mind, it would mean it would cease to exist, the loss of the potential savior. On the other hand, completely repressing that knowledge or ignoring it would seem to mean closing off a large number of other possible paths of inquiry and speculation, effectively ending the soteriological function of the search for Valis, which is the exegesis. In both directions, the possible path leading out of the maze seems to be closed off. But Dick's great inventiveness, on an unconscious and conscious level, I guess, is what allows him to change this situation and to find another alternative, to produce an alternative to this seemingly totalizing binary. By the later years of the exegesis, certainly by the time he's completed the novel Valis, he seems to have rendered the question of whether or not he is the creator or of the entity Valis insignificant with regard to its saving power, its effectiveness. It's a bit like Pascal's wager. You know, he applies probability theory. If I believe in God and God turns out to exist, I'll feel better. If it turns out he didn't exist, oh well, I felt better for most of my life, so who cares? Right. It's not that simple, but with Dick, it never is. But, and it's also not as simple as a placebo effect, although, you know, there are studies now apparently that show that even knowing that you're taking a placebo doesn't reduce its effectiveness by a great deal. I want to close by referencing a moment that's quite well cited, as far as the exegesis is well cited, because it was quite prominent in the Sutin short collection of excerpts from the exegesis, which is the encounter with God that Dick imagines, a sort of dialogue between him and God. And I want to do this because this is a very clear example of where he seems to be accepting the placebo, accepting that he is the creator of Valis, and saying that it doesn't matter. This is an account of a theophany dated November 17th, 1980, in which he recounts this conversation between him and God, who identifies himself as the infinite void. And in this discussion, the identity between Dick's theoretical explanations of 2.3.74 and God is made explicit. And each one leads to an infinity of theses and counter-theses, and each time God declares that he is present in that infinity. This seems to indicate that Dick is, by this time, aware that his search is interminable. And he has God say to him each night, when you go to bed, you think, at last, I found it. I tried out theory after theory until now. Finally, I have the right one. And then the next morning, you wake up and say, there's one fact that's not explained by that theory. I will have to think up another theory. And so you do. By now, it is evident to you that you are going to think up an infinite number of theories, limited only by your lifespan, not limited by your creative imagination. Each theory gives rise to another theory, inevitably. That's the end of that long quotation. I'm almost at the end now. So even in elaborating the interminable nature of his own exegesis, Dick continues to produce it, fictionalizing God, even as that same fictional God tells him that he will never have an answer. Yet at the same time, that infinity of possible theorizing is the answer. God says, without realizing it, the very infinitude of your theories pointed to the solution. They pointed to me and none but me. Immediately after the account, Dick concludes that he's been deceived by Satan into producing the whole exegesis and says it's been a hell chore and it's futile, but nevertheless, it has paradoxically led him to God only through his recognition of this fact. It's the Sisyphus scenario again. God, or Valis, is the dynamic, complex system of exegetical speculating and theorizing that he has developed, having originally thought God had been the inspiration for it. Note that both Dick and God notice that although the game will stop when Dick is tired and dies, God in his infinity will never need to stop playing. This mystical, or seemingly mystical scenario points to the very immanent nature of Valis as what we might call a media ecology. If I had more time, I'd go into discussing that term. Or an ecology, an ecological entity per se. Dick has created such a large body of interlocking, contradicting, enhancing ideas and fictions that they've gone on long after their physical death, as was suggested earlier, I think by Rudy. And what we're doing here is still, of course, part of the growth of this ecological entity, of Valis. So that's the reason for my other talk, my other quotation as a title for the talk, which was perhaps he's collaborating in the writing of this right now. Because that's what Dick says of Valis, possibly Thomas, when he's writing the exegesis. And I think it's legitimate to say that the continued dynamic, growing nature of Valis is such that it is indeed collaborating in this talk and in this conference and what we're doing. And that doesn't have to be a mystical thing at all. That can be, you can say that in quite an immanent sense. And so, who is to say that ultimately this subsumption into infinity that we're engaged in, every time you try to comment on or analyze Valis, you're immediately part of it. Who's to say that that infinity isn't a form of God? And that's it.
So I was just curious, because this is actually kind of where you went anyway. Did Dick ever address the idea of a distributed intelligence or a hive mind explicitly in any of his work? Because it seems like this really kind of goes with what you were just saying.
Absolutely. It's there a lot in the exegesis. And I'm not at all pretending, I've gone through it once, but it's absolutely there.